what is this haunting piece of artwork behind me? Is it some sort of pop art, modern art, cool looking, scary thing for Halloween? No, actually this is a really kind of sober memorial dedicated to the victims of the Irish Potato Famine of 1845 to 1852. This famine occurred across all of Ireland. This memorial is located here, right on the waterfront of the River Liffey, just the Liffey if you're local here. In the center of Dublin, Ireland, capital of Ireland. The river empties out right here at the mouth where it empties out into the Irish Sea and all points beyond. And that's important. This memorial is located at this exact geographic point for very good reason. And it has everything to do with the famine and people leaving here. And I also want to talk about worldwide impacts and modern day impacts of this famine. Okay, what's this all about? If you know anything about Irish history, and you probably don't, and that's okay, you might have at least heard passing reference to this thing called the Potato Famine. It's otherwise known as the Hunger, or the Famine, or the Great Famine, and we reference it as the Great Irish Potato Famine of 1845, wherein the population of Ireland at the time, about 8 million people, woke up one day and suddenly their main staple crop of the stuff that they eat every day was disappearing. At that time, in 1845, the Irish average person, and this is the peasants, I'm not gonna lie, this is the lower class, middle to lower class, that relied heavily on the potato as the life bread that their sustenance they ate every single day. I think the average was 12 pounds of potatoes per person per day of consumption. That's how heavily reliant they were on this one crop. And they woke up one day and there was a little bit of a blight on the potatoes, on the plants, and within 2 weeks the entire crop was wiped out across the entire country. And it wasn't just wiped out, the potato plant just didn't die. It actually made the potatoes rot in the ground, and they said the stench in the fields was so horrific, you couldn't even stand to dig up and replant the fields. And it was a catastrophe for the state of Ireland, because the great majority of 8 million people relied on this one crop to live every day, and suddenly it was wiped out in its entirety. This caused an immediate famine effect. 8 million people in 1845. 1 million of these people died within the next couple years. 1 million people died, starved to death. Again, depicted with these haunting statues behind me. 1 million more emigrated out of Ireland to somewhere else to get the heck out of this catastrophe. Within the next 3 years, 1846, 1847, 1848, about 1 million of these folks made it to the shores of America, the US and Canada, I might add. And that's why this is an important geographic point, because this is the spot which the first ship left from. Down the river, I don't know if it was called the Jeannie Johnson, there's a replica of the Hunger ship down there. They call them the Hunger ships. People emigrating by the hundreds of thousands out of this exact place to get somewhere else, mostly America, Canada, some as far afield as Mexico, the Caribbean, New Zealand, Australia. But this is important to understand today's world, because this was not the start, but really the engine behind what I call the Irish diaspora. That is the dispersion of Irish peoples around the globe. Somewhere on the order of 7 to 10 million Irish folks emigrated out of this country from 1700 to about 1900. Many of them, of course, went to America, maybe 5 to 10 million of them. I believe in today's Canada, there's 3 to 4 million folks of Irish heritage. So there's this big impact of Irish culture across the rest of the planet, due partly to natural immigration, but also accelerated by this famine situation. And they've had big impact in America. The Irish mostly went to Boston, Mass, and New York, wherein they became dominant in, say, Catholic hierarchy, local politics, the fire department, police departments. These are distinctly Irish things in those American cities. And again, a lot of Irish ended up in Canada. So what you have here, even in the modern day, is that something like 80 million people worldwide would claim some sort of Irish heritage. That's a true Irish diaspora. The Irish are everywhere all over the planet. And this sad situation is part of the reason why that is. Now, is this just a history lesson? well, that's a quaint thing, and people starved to death. And their population of Ireland was reduced by 20% in a 2-year period. They didn't recover from that for 100 years. So was this just a historical relic? No, my friends, not at all. In fact, the more I learned about this particular Great Famine, the more I am coming to realize that you're probably going to see something like this again, if it's not happening already. What am I referring to? I'm referring to the point that this famine wasn't simply because potatoes just stopped growing because of a disease. Here's the real deal. Ireland was exporting food during this famine. Was exporting food while 1 million of their citizens died and 1 million more left. What? How is that possible? Because I haven't really filled in the whole picture here. Again, this isn't just about a plant that died. The Irish are a people. It's an island and a country and a people that were dominated, nay, destroyed by British occupation from about 1600 onward until independence in 1922. The British essentially colonized this, turned it into a gigantic plantation, pretty much enslaved the people, pretty much took all the land. And again, this sounds really hard on the British. Sorry, British, it's true, and you know it. This may have been the most brutal colonization of the last 1,000 years, was the British takeover of the island of Ireland. People were less than human. The British took all the land, brought in their business folks, their Protestant business folks, into this predominantly Catholic country, and became a hierarchy at the top that owned all the land, controlled all the business, ran everything. And that's the point I'm trying to get to, back to this famine. They were growing food for export back to Great Britain. Ireland at the time was essentially an agricultural colony of Great Britain. I don't know any nicer way to put it because it doesn't sound very nice, but the British completely controlled and dominated the economy. Ireland was never allowed to industrialize. Ireland wasn't allowed to stand up on its own feet and export its own products. So if any of the Irish products were to compete with British industries, the British would come and shut them down. So if the Irish started a wool production and people started making wool at really cheap prices and started exporting wool, the British would pass a law and say, you guys aren't allowed to export wool. Oh, you guys can't export glass either. Oh, you guys can't export linens. Oh, you can't export beef. Anything that would compete with the British economy, they would shut it down. So that set up a scenario of this was an agricultural colony. The British only let them grow food so that it could be exported into Great Britain, a much bigger country with a bigger population that needed that food. Does that make sense? So it was British domination of the island, British domination of the economy, manipulation of the economy, that then created this mass of people, again, almost 8 million of them, I'm assuming wildly uneducated, unskilled, mostly working in fields, rural population, with no great potential to do much else because the British wouldn't let them. And then you put the potato blight on top of that, a very cheap crop that was easy to grow. It would grow in crappy lands, which is where the British had pushed most of the local Irish to crappy lands. So you had this crop that would grow in marginal and crappy lands that would produce a lot of food, and they were heavily reliant on it. And while they were exporting food, when that potato blight hit, people were dying here while you were sending rye and barley and beef back over the Irish Sea to Great Britain. Some claim this is almost a genocide situation, that the British allowed this to happen, did not intervene early enough, if at all, to help all these starving people, because in their eyes, well, it's just a colony. Well, we just want the food. We don't care about the locals. Let them all die. Really significantly nasty situation. And now let me wrap up with this. Again, it's just a history lesson. I've tried now to fill in the blanks about this, of how this potato famine happened, because I think you're going to see it happening again. I think it may be happening already. What other parts of the planet are now predominantly agricultural colonies of other rich countries that need food, where foreign companies may be coming in to dominate land control policy and economic policy to benefit their foreign countries as opposed to local country? I think one need look no further than Africa. I believe there's a current scramble for Africa that's going on right now, where it's mostly Chinese and Indian companies who are going into Africa to grab up big chunks of land that can produce tons and tons of agricultural products, from rice to soybean to sugar cane to beets to everything, Africa's a gigantic continent, and most of the people there are kind of poor, and their economies are kind of not developed, and they're not very industrialized. They're heavily reliant on agricultural commodities, and now you have foreign countries that are coming in and saying, hey, we've got 1 billion people in India. Hey, we've got 1.4 billion people in China. We can't produce enough food locally to feed our own peoples. Hey, look, there's Africa over there. They got a ton of land and a bunch of cheap labor, and they can grow food there. Let's go over there, buy up land, invest, have our companies invest over there to produce agricultural commodities to sail back home to feed our populations. That is a process that's already been happening in Africa. It's been happening for a while, but really accelerated in the last 10 to 20 years as China's gotten rich and started to go out into the world, and their businesses have been buying up more things, and India's getting a little richer and going out in the world to try to boost up their food supply. This is actively happening. And when you hear of a famine in Africa now, when you hear about people starving in Ethiopia now, you should think about this. I am, because this is the same scenario unfolding again in the modern era. Here in the 21st century, there will be people starving to death in Africa as they export food. Again, that's probably already been the case for decades. I think it's going to be exacerbated in the modern era as we see tons of food get exported out of Africa, while local populations that are mostly uneducated, mostly rural, mostly not industrialized, and don't control their own economy suffer as a result of that. Does that make sense? You see the global ties that have come out of this particular historic situation here in Ireland that again are playing through to the modern day. So the Irish Potato Famine of 1845 unleashed a huge movement of Irish people globally, which have impacted global culture. Where do they not celebrate St. Paddy's Day in today's world? Everybody's Irish on March 17th. That's a sign of mass immigration off of this awesome island. But also this historic circumstance is a red light to pay attention to food security. And that's the word I should have thrown in earlier. Food security, or the alternative, food insecurity. What are countries going to do to make sure their own people don't starve to death while they're exporting food, which is exactly the situation that caused this gigantic disaster in Ireland back in 1845, 1846, 1847.